Okay, let's jump right into this. This is post-orthodoxy, mid-June, finance capital, and the current housing crisis, housing inflation, however you want to phrase that. The initial piece of writing is posted in a link on the post-orthodoxy web pages from a philosophy. So when it comes to BlackRock and private capital are buying every piece of real estate they can get their hands on and driving up prices. Why? Um, Real estate has just become another asset class. So, with the way that rules are currently constructed, everybody that has cash laying around that really isn't doing anything is really just hedging against their other market positions. So people that have an extensive stock portfolio and those that have of us that have been advantageous enough to participate in a meaningful way knows that that market is probably a little bit too hot, whether you believe that or you don't. Real estate and other hard assets become the natural solution to making yourself safe when you think that you may take losses elsewhere, right? So everyone hyperventilating about inflation right now and hyperinflation and de-dollarization and the loss in value of the dollar. Those are all the people that you have screaming about gold and silver and Bitcoin and crypto and get away from the dollar. We can't take any more dollars. They're worthless. So that's really all it is. Zoning laws contribute to the current housing shortages. And that has a lot to do with municipal infrastructure limits. So, Silicon Valley, Oakland, San Francisco, the Bay Area, they are averse to building a lot more high rises to accommodate the people that want to go there. So, that's going to drive up prices. Whereas there are other urban areas that are a little bit more loose about that stuff. So that some of the housing inflation is self-made by municipal zoning codes. Construction costs also play a role. Speculation on lumber for single-family residences, or as the piece calls them, single-family rentals, which is the new iteration, and that is exactly true and what's happening right now in front of our face when it comes to the preposterous skyrocketing increase in building materials that branched out from lumber costs. So during the height of COVID, when everyone was super freaked out and scared, sawmills shut down. So you had tons and tons of orders not being filled. There are actually a lot of trees. During the Reagan administration, a lot of people in the Gulf states or the Bible Belt or the American South were paid to turn their crops into trees, so that there were too many soybeans and corn and things of that nature. So they were given farm subsidies to turn their land into trees instead. So there's actually plenty of trees to satisfy the lumber needs of the housing market. It's actually the sawmills and Chicago commodity speculators that caused the crazy jump in lumber prices. And a lot of the inflationary spikes right now are coming from COVID winding down and the areas that people are really excited about now that it's winding down and it's coming to a close in a general manner. So Construction costs really came from lumber sawmills and speculators, and then the trade war tariffs that we have going on with China has made steel really expensive. So we outsourced steel to the point where deindustrialized Rust Belt cities, all of those factories were being literally dismantled, and all of those junkyards were being filled up with usable material, and then they were all just being chucked onto a cargo ship and sent to China to be repurposed into Chinese I-beams. So when our lumber market skyrocketed and people started looking at alternative building materials, the Chinese aren't stupid. They paid attention to that. So steel prices started immediately going up, whether they be local or otherwise. So it's this is just another case of cash is king, and whoever's hoarding these materials know that other people want them, so they drive their prices up to make more money. So, and then at the shareholder level, the people that have shares in those companies know that they can get a short-term payday off of inflating the cost of these materials. So why wouldn't they do that too? So that's part of the problem. And then changing demographics. You have people heading down south for cheaper real estate. So you have people in California and Oregon and Washington and New York and Jersey and Michigan, and you have people leaving areas that people actually want to live and heading down south to Texas and the like, just because real estate costs are a lot cheaper. So you can trade an old turn of the century Tudor or bungalow or whatever that's $1.2 million in a longly established, wealthier, upper middle class neighborhood, and go buy a McMansion in a Texas suburb for only $400,000, pay for your kid's school, pay off all your credit cards, consolidate your debt basically for free, and live in a bigger, newer house. So redistributive policies have a lot to do with that, because the areas that people are currently moving to, everybody's moving to them. So they're highly sought after areas. The areas that are increasing population and the areas that are decreasing population are all very, very similar, and they're all linked together. So that's also adding to inflated prices. So then, you have these redistributive policies of hyperglobalism or neoliberalism and Reaganite, Margaret Thatcher trickle-down economics, and this is what that looks like. So the tenor of the original piece from A Philosophy is a little bit problematic in tone just for that reason. There's no evil cabal going on or anything like that. This is just the liberalization and globalization of supply chains and finance and capital. This is the natural evolution of what that looks like. Like, this has already been codified into law. Like, this is what everyone has agreed to do. So it's really just a battle right now of the Keynesian model, which I would take the position has turned into just socialism for banks and rich people and the Fortune 500, the Keynesian model being the FDR, oh my goodness, we have to do something to help, the economy's in bad shape, and it's starting to hurt everyone. We absolutely have to do something, versus the Chicago School Hayekian, Austrian, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama model of saying, hey, let's hang back. Let's just make sure billionaires and millionaires and banks and industry have what they need to keep going, and then the rest will kind of just sort itself out. So you have FDR and Eisenhower, and even to a certain degree, Richard Nixon on one side, and then there's the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama people on the other side of the economic model that just says, hey, as long as billionaires and industry have more money, we trust we trust their ideology and their morality and their savvy to make sure it gets sorted out for everybody else. We're going to let the technocrats and the smart people just do their jobs, and we'll leave the bush trimmers and burger flippers and toilet scrubbers and nurses to they can just do what they can do. They don't have to pay attention to any of this. The Great Reset, that was just the name of the Davos meeting of the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum makes all of their meetings public. So they have a public release of what the meeting was. There's hours and hours and hours of the speakers that were invited to the forum. Anand Giridharadas gives really good talks on this, which basically just says rich people will save everything if we just give them more time and all the money and don't think for ourselves or participate in these conversations in any meaningful way. The piece then brings up SFRs, which formerly stood for single family residences, as opposed to single family rentals, which is absolutely happening. Blackstone, BlackRock, all the big hedge funds. And this is basically a reverse of 2008. So the 2008 housing crash was for ninjas and a lot of free, cheap money printed by the Fed to be allowed to be given out to retail consumers. Ninja stood for no income, no job. You were basically allowed to verify a purported income and asset class of some sort to justify getting a bank loan to become a homeowner. So then there were derivatives built off of that. Those derivatives were used as hedges and insurance policies for other really sketchy investments that were being made by the investor class. And then after the LIBOR scandal, where the rating agencies were caught rating these derivatives and funds that packaged all of these subprime mortgages together as a safe investment for the pensions of nurses and teachers and cops and firefighters and so on and so forth. They were all packaged as A-rated investment. Cities were buying them and participating. So when that blew up and everything took a downturn because everyone realized that those were investments were a house of cards, not only did a bunch of people get their houses taken away and have to file bankruptcy, but there was $2.4 trillion real that was lost in everyone's IRAs and Roths and Keoghs and annuities and things of that nature. Anything that was attached in a meaningful way to that market lost to the tune of about 25% generally. So that creates a very fair question. Why does the United States push intergenerational wealth into property ownership? That's a conversation worth having. The piece then asked a provocative question, and it says, is the Great Reset, is this a reorganization of society? So that's an interesting question, and that's a conversation worth having. A reorganization of what society? Society in the United States, society globally, and is it really a reorganization? So that's an interesting question, and I would take the position that no, not really. It isn't a reorganization of any kind, anywhere, of any ruling ideology or sociological order. People that value and appreciate the current financialization and hyper-globalization and libertarian free market they'll always point to a major reduction in global poverty and people living on less than $1 a day. So they'll say, because we enacted all of these capital flight policies, there are way less starving people, and especially less starving children. And oh, by the way, they all happen to be black or brown or yellow. They're a community that you care about somewhere in the rural global South. So all the Sally Struthers commercials from the 80s with the African kids with the flies on their faces and the distended starving bellies, they'll say, hey, if we didn't do this, you would still have to watch those commercials all the time, and it would really super bum you out. So that's a really interesting conversation, because where did all those supply chains go? Whose wealth was affected by that? Do you think that the American working or poor or middle class, when they're the ones that have taken the haircut, care about who is starving or not starving in Bangladesh or Afghanistan or India or in the Congo? I don't think that they do. I mean, the popular right-wing immigration policy of, hey, don't come here, we don't want you here, stay out, I think that would indicate that there are a lot of citizens in the United States that are very leery and averse to decreasing their own personal living standards to the benefit of strangers in countries that they've never been to, don't want to go to, and don't care about. So I think that's a very interesting conversation. Is this a reorganization of the working and middle class in the United States? I think that's the more appropriate question in framing, and I would say that it is. So the idea that Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or Donald Trump are going to save Cat and Harley Davidson and bring back manufacturing in some booming way, and unionization is going to create a new CIO and a Big Bill Haywood Wobblies interpretation of full employment and create increasing wages, I would be really skeptical of that. Major industrialization, those supply chains are gone forever. Like Apple, everyone's iPhones are built in China for a reason. Are Americans gonna live 8 people to a room in state-built dormitories to make cars or phones for people and work for like $3.50 an hour? I mean, I would be very skeptical of that, and I don't think that's going to happen again in a meaningful way. I mean, the reality is China has almost 1.5 billion people in that country with a workforce that is completely pliable to state intervention, that doesn't get paid very well, but because they aren't getting starved to death, toiling in a rice paddy field somewhere, they're cool with what is currently happening. So, are Americans going to deal with those kind of conditions? I would be really skeptical of that. The idea that there's going to be any major reindustrialization of the United States, it's a farce. It's a fallacy. That isn't going to happen. And then another thing that becomes extremely interesting about that is right next door you have India with 1 billion people. China is already turning to de-dollarization and domestic consumption, and investing in infrastructure everywhere. So what's going to happen when China runs out of labor? They've already loosened their child policy to 3 or more children, which means they want more indentured servitude, slave type labor. And they just have to look right next door to India. If they agree, the only thing stopping from India copying the Chinese model is the lack of infrastructure. So you're just going to have a repeat of deindustrialization in the Western countries if capital flight and supply chains decide to hike it over to India and Indonesia. So that's a conversation worth having. The major reorganization in the United States, since we're talking about our domestic housing crisis, that happened as soon as the CEO of Merrill Lynch leaned over to newly elected Ronald Reagan during the ceremonial ringing of the bell to open the stock exchange, and he literally whispered to Reagan, "Hurry up, I have stuff to do. You're taking too long." The globalists or neoliberals and the Chicago Hayekian Friedman free marketers, they finally had their man in Reagan to enact the Volcker shock. So Paul Volcker, skyrocketed interest rates, and they also, at the same time, they decided to fire all the air traffic controllers purposely. They started a massive recession on purpose and traumatized the labor force into capitulating to what has now turned into completely flat, frozen wages for the last 40 years, a traumatized labor force, and what is now what is called the right to work model, where they want to abolish the minimum wage because any traumatized person that's willing to take a job somewhere should just have to work. So is making homeownership out of reach unhealthy for society? I think so. What are possible solutions? There's subsidized public housing models in Vienna, Austria, for example, that work really well. The piece refers to the current climate as warfare, which I find that kind of language to be dangerous. The piece says it's a greater threat than communism, which is really weird because what does that even have to do with anything about the American housing market? The fastest growing economy in the world right now, and for the last 20 years, is actually the People's Republic of China. Chinese, Russian, Saudi money is also raising the cost of real estate speculation through their own models of capital flight. The author then mentions BLM, and that's also really strange, as my understanding of BLM is that it's an organization that advocates for social and racial justice, which affordable quality housing and infrastructure would certainly be a major component of that. So I thought that was a little bit weird. The initial thread then goes into the printing of green funny money, and that gets into MMT, corporate socialism, how public debt is going to lead to austerity, and the libertarian fear mongering about debt and what it means and what it is and who creates it and who holds it and who's responsible for paying it. It also mentions a 2020 cabal and the COVID truth about turning over an election and things of that nature. That's also really inartful, unhelpful, silly language. I mean, does anybody really think a political party in the United States would have done anything to rein in what capital was going to demand and do during COVID? I mean, does anyone think one particular politician or party would have stopped what they chose to do? They already had the 2008 Barack Obama, Richard Rubin, Tim Geithner playbook on what a bailout should look like. All of these laws and policies, they were already written and turned in by lobbyists and think tanks and firms. They were just waiting for the opportunity to turn in the language for these next bailouts and a reason to institute it. So if time permits, here is a deeper dive into the current conditions, where it came from and where it could lead to. There's a recent study from the Rand Corporation on wealth transfer, and this just came out like in October or November of 2020. So it shows a $34 trillion wealth and asset transfer from the bottom 90% to the top 10%. So what that looks like in real dollars is that averages out to $16,000 per year per household in the United States. So everybody should be asking themselves, since the Institute of Neoliberal Hyper-Globalist Trickle-Down Reagan Economics, would have my lot or my family's lot been different if we had access to $665,000 more dollars over the last 40 years? So that's a question worth asking. The Piketty elephant curve and R versus G and redistribution by deindustrialization and financialization. That's part of all this. That's a conversation that's worth having. Austerity in the United States and declining living standards. So part of all of the free-fed hot money that is part and parcel of causing this housing inflation, that's what it's going to lead to politically and policy-wise, and that's a conversation worth having. Precarity as a permanent feature of labor. Even more important than inequality is the Uberification, if you will, of the labor market. So all of these subcontractor, you're your own business, you have no job guarantees, you work for low wages, we won't give you retirement that means anything. If we do, we're just going to pretend we go broke and file bankruptcy later, and you're not going to get it anyway. We'll fire you at any time. So we have maximum what they call dynamism in our labor market, and that means you're just going to be paid really crappy. You're not going to be guaranteed employment for a very long period of time. You're going to be able to be fired for no reason, and if that happens to you, kick rocks. Figure it out. Is the stock market the real economy? If it is, what does that mean for everybody? Neoliberal policies in Latin America You can already see what this looks like. None of this is philosophical or theoretical. If you want to know what the United States is going to look like over the next 10 or 20 years without meaningful participation by its own populace, all you have to do is look to the regimes that we put into power in Latin America. And that's really what it's going to look like. So Pinochet's Chile, the Banana Republic in Guatemala, on and on and on. What happened in Panama? I mean, you don't have to look very far to see what everyone is in store for once the commons are eliminated and everything is handed over to Goldman Sachs and private capital. So, housing boom specific, to get back to the theme of the show, wood prices and building materials. So sawmills shut down during COVID. So a lot of the spike in building materials was really just greedy commodity speculators and greedy sawmills. The inflation that's currently happening is only going to continue for the professional managerial class and people that are doing really well. So the lords and ladies of the current economy in the United States are the ones that only have any money and credit and assets left to take. So they're going to see increasing prices, in the services that are directly provided to them. Breaking the commons in the public sphere for the benefit of private capital. You get perfect examples of this from Rahm Emanuel selling Chicago's parking to Goldman Sachs. Parking rates explode. Rick Snyder in Michigan poisoning a water supply to the benefit of private capital. So you're gonna have things of that nature happening over and over and over again as this myth that private capital and corporations, government's bad, they're stupid, they're inefficient. Private capital's good. Let's turn these systems over to bondholders, when the reality is these bondholders are located all over the world. They don't care about your town, or they don't care about your community. They don't care if your kid gets poisoned by the water, as long as they're making money and they can cash out before they actually have to replace all the lead pipes or whatever. So this rugged individualism and culture war and bootstraps in the United States keep everyone on the couch screaming at a screen instead of breaking bread with each other and building solidarity. It also leads to the structural hypocrisy of both mainstream political parties in the United States. The Obama, Clinton, Oprah Winfrey liberals say, as long as everyone puts on pussy hats and holds hands, I'm totally cool with 800 military bases surrounding the planet Earth and bombing minorities I don't know in the global South, or laying spikes on the ground, or planting cactus gardens in Echo Park so I don't have to see or smell homeless people on my morning stroll, so long as no one is using crass language in my office or in my Facebook subdivisions group and oppressing me or my children with microaggressions. And the right-wing version of the hypocrisy looks like, poor, disenfranchised, rural people. It poses the question, aren't these snobby, pompous Hollywood, New York, Jew, blood-drinking, transvestite, weirdo people wanting open borders just horrible and the worst and traitors, and we should hang them and have another civil war? Just keep giving us all the money and tax breaks, and we'll own the libs together and call them libtards, and we'll get your mining job back for you someday. Maybe, but first we just gotta take care of our oil and gas buddies and their shareholders first for a little bit longer. We'll get to it, we promise. So there's this glorification of work on television and social media versus the actual laziness and worthlessness of the leisure class. So So we glorify work in pickup truck commercials, and we make fun of all of these mythical welfare queens when the real welfare queens are banks and oil and gas and the Fortune 500 that are connected to it. And we say, oh, well, if you're not breaking rocks or digging a ditch or flipping burgers somewhere or, wiping an old person's butt, then I guess, you're just worthless and you're not participating in the economy in a meaningful way. So in a country that supposedly glorifies money and glorifies work, why would we make kings and queens of people that are literally born with property and money and don't ever have to try in school or think anything or actually contribute or do anything? The money, their money from the second they're born just makes money. I mean, the leisure class has never been worth very much. If you look back to the Medici Bank and the Italian Renaissance, those people weren't the painters and sculptors and musicians of that time. Some of the cultural things that we hold the most dear of Western society, it wasn't accomplished by the rich people of that time. The rich people of that time just financed it. They just allowed the actual artists to make art. So that's a conversation that's worth happening. This is from John Friedman and Mark Blythe from the Watson Institute at Brown University, about the current economic climate that is leading to, amongst other things, the current increase in housing prices. So Biden is taking the position, or rhetorically at least, that we can change the growth trajectory of the entire economy without the spooky, evil stagflation of the 70s. So this is why everyone screams and fusses and cries about inflation, right? So austerity. So this is just an argument versus austerity and cutting your way to growth, which is the Art Laffer, idiot Reaganite policy of cutting your way to growth, versus actually growing and inflating away the debt, which is, if you really care about debt, you should be paying for it during the boom times. So all of the CNBC, Fox News, Fox Business crowd, all of those that are attached to the oligarchy and the leisure class say, if they really care about debt, oh my God, the debt. Well, then why aren't you helping pay down the debt? So which is it? Are you scared about debt? And this is the hottest, greatest, most booming economy of all time ever in human history, and we need to keep it this way forever? Or are you scared of debt and you want to address that? Because if you want to address that, you're the ones with all the money. You should be paying to service the debt if that's what you care about. So both of those things can't be true simultaneously. So that's creating a very weird tension of austerity versus MMT, and that's a conversation worth having. Investment in human capital versus just bailing out bondholders after they make bad investments time after time after time after time. That's a conversation worth having. The post-war economy that most people in the United States glorify, and the world still has some weird, strange vision of and affinity toward. The post-war booming 50s, so hot rods, burgers, Levi's, Madison Avenue, all the post-World War II, when those boys got home and we built all of these roads and bridges and revitalize our skyscrapers and put up new ones. And so the post-World War II boom, it grew very quickly for about 30 years. And then as soon as you have OPEC putting a kibosh on cheap oil, and then you have the inflationary pressures of full employment creating stagflation in the 70s, you get this lean immediately right around 1980 for the outsourcing of global supply chains, the deindustrialization of the United States, capital flight, chastising labor, busting up unions. So you get complete and total adherence to the Milton Friedman Chicago School crowd at the lower levels of the economy. And then as this begins to create exploding deficits for the federal treasury, people start freaking out. And they change that into the Clinton NAFTA further outsourcing, financialization, speculation, austerity at the lower levels. You see this immediate tax burden transitioning from those that create and have to those that just consume. You see an explosion of private debt. You see an explosion of credit cards. There is a commercial real estate bubble right now that no one wants to talk about. And with everyone being able, all the white collar people being able to do their job at a higher level from home, their home offices, instead of actual offices and buildings, you have a ton of buildings that are still sitting empty, and you have the talent that has the education to do these jobs that are being glorified saying, hey, well, if you try and make me come back to work, you can piss off. I'll just find another job that lets me work from home. So skill demands are changing very quickly, which means if you're going to increase college participation, is it helpful to saddle everyone leaving university with debt? I mean, Czech, the former Czech Republic doesn't charge their kids for school. Germany doesn't charge anybody to go to school there. If we're going to have an explosion of education, I think it's a very worthwhile question that has to be answered. Should people be going to school leaving with all this debt? So it's an empirical fact that if you're rich or white or a boy or all the above, you're most likely to excel at math and innovation and dynamism under this current order. I alluded to this previously. The Trends in Income is the title of the Rand Corporation's report last fall, where you can literally see the 34 trillion going from the bottom 90 to the top 10. Everyone should look that up. Is it possible to grow wages without going over an inflationary target? And then if you're going to talk about inflation in a meaningful way, you have to talk about what is short-term and what is long-term and what is just a current spike. So right now you have everyone on the news channels freaking out about inflation and hyperinflation and what that means. And the reality is a lot of it's just COVID related. Everyone with money wants to go out. Savings rates have been very high for people that actually have money because they haven't had anywhere to spend it. They already live somewhere pretty. They've been working from home. They're not comfortable going out. There's not really been much to do. So you'll have this summer sugar high where everyone wants to go out and party and concerts and bowling or whatever your thing is. There's another important study that's already been publicly released from the Cleveland Federal Bank. So all of this inflation that everyone's hyperventilating and screaming about, we've already addressed the inflation in the lumber market. It's already busted. So there was a boom and there's a bust. The other inflation has been in airline tickets. Everybody is sick of hanging out at home. They want to go see people that they love and miss all over the world as it begins to open back up. So there's been an inflation in airline tickets. There's been an inflation in computer periphery and parts. We're currently having a trade war with China. We can't even get enough semiconductors and chips to put in our own vehicles. We outsourced those supply chains long ago. We're taking a hostile position towards them. So there's been a huge freeze and lag in computer parts. So those are more expensive right now. Same thing with auto parts. I was in Houston building a strip mall when COVID first popped off. The streets were basically just abandoned. You had one of the largest cities in the United States. There was no such thing as rush hour on a typical business day, which normally freeways are a total, basically just a giant parking lot. So there was a huge freeze on auto parts. And then the other inflation was used trucks. There was a halt of major construction activity, which is another part of the housing inflation. Labor costs more. These guys were put out of work. We told everybody to basically bugger off. And then if you're going to use cheap, illegal Latin labor in a lot of markets to build these things in the first place, and then you're going to deport them and send them back home. The legal people that aren't scared to keep building stuff here, they can basically work wherever they want, and they're booked up for long periods of time. The labor's going to cost more. So that's also another part of the housing inflation. So and then just over the last 15 or 20 years, with all this in financialization in the real economy, you have housing prices are up, rent is up, school is up, medical care is up. So who's going to incur all of these price increases if you tell poor and working people basically to just bugger off? We don't want you. We don't need you. The only people that have any money left to take are the $75,000 and up crowds. So all of the professional managerial class, everybody holding degrees, all the high skilled positions, their wages are rising rapidly while everyone else's has been frozen. So they're the only people with money left to take. So what is the 1% going to do naturally when that becomes the case? They're going to take money from the lords and ladies and the next 20% down that are the only people with rising wages and money and assets left to speculate on. So it's basically just a soft tax on your rising wages, and the PMC is going to endure all of these levels of inflation. Tolls are going to go up. Medical care is going to go up. Everything that you actually care about, your kid's private school, the daycare that they go to, everything directly attached to you in your fancy subdivision next to a Starbucks and a PCC or a Whole Foods, all of your costs are going to explode. Because the people that actually own that stuff know the only place to get money is from you. So if you want to balance that a little bit, the only thing to do is to get rising wages at the bottom. Pre-pandemic, 50% of people in the United States already made $30,000 a year or less in the most debt-ridden society in human history. So that's going to come to a head. What are we going to do about that? 70% of the American economy pre-pandemic was already based on frivolous consumption and spending. Movies, food, blah, 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 blah. You name it, that's what it's based on. It's always been bread and circus. So working people spend 100% of their income into the economy because they're poor. They don't have anything left over. So if we're not going to do that anymore, or we're not going to speculate on that anymore, that's fine. But that's a conversation worth having, and that delegitimizes the previous American soft power geopolitical model of eagles and fireworks and hot rods and burgers and roller skates and happy days and all of that. So that's a conversation worth having if we're agreeing that that's old and dead and we're not going to do that anymore. Then people should have to talk about that. Building codes matter for affordable housing. Housing as an asset class. Housing in general in the United States, it's kind of always been a racket. Men without property weren't even allowed to vote at the beginning. Then you had 40 acres and a mule, which turned out to be a fraud and a lie. Then you had the post-World War II redlining, keeping only certain people to be able to get cheap credit to buy houses. And then if you were lucky enough to buy a house in the 60s or 70s during a downturn, you then had the Volcker shock that exploded interest rates, and the banks basically inflated away most of your debt. In some cases, all of it. I mean, houses not that long ago were only like twice the price as the typical family car. So you didn't do anything to earn that. If you're from a family that had one of those houses, you were just, fortunate to exist at that time and be able to buy or own a house. So we can talk about inflation and hyperinflation. All the inflation is going to go into housing and luxury goods and art and yachts, and then that comes into play into hedge against your market positions, using it as tax havens. So there's nothing evil or Kabbalistic, if you will, about any of this. Rich people are just following the rules that they've created for themselves that have been codified into law. All of this stuff is the natural evolution of these markets. All of this stuff is currently legal. Whether you think it's good or bad, I mean, what's the point of even categorizing it as that? If you really care about that, you have to be able to discuss these things and tell your family and friends in a meaningful way. And if you really want to adjust these problems, you have to address them publicly and be able to bring it out into the light and be able to speak about it in a meaningful way. So, the split between normal people and working people need to be able to talk about debt in a meaningful way, or it's just going to continue to move into a great Gatsby roaring 20s socialism for the rich and punishing bootstrap austerity for poor and working people, and hipsters and wine moms joining rural folks who hate identity politics are just going to continue to justify to keep the current order in place. So in closing, what could this lead to? Public debt will lead to calls for austerity. So how we spend that public debt matters. How much public debt we allow to be injected into the system, and who, what, when, where, how, why, that all matters. The IMF's own internal documents is a small office in the basement of the Pentagon. Their publicly released statements already show that austerity does not lead to debt reduction or growth. This is going to lead to more bailouts for banks and corporations and leave poor and working people with crumbling infrastructure, declining living standards, as small towns and cities sell out their schools, water systems, roads, garbage service, parking structures, parks. They're all going to go to Goldman Sachs and BlackRock and Blackstone. Um, excuse me. We're all exposed now to a Pinochet Chilean model of neoliberalism, or the Greek model. We're all Greeks right now. If you want to see how the poor and working population in the United States is going to be treated over the next 10 or 20 years, it's going to be exactly what the EU and the Germans and the other Europeans banks have done to the Greeks. That's exactly what's going to happen. Everything is going to be injected to bail out the top 20%, and 80% of that is just going to serve the top 1% of our current pharaohs and private astronauts like Bezos. So if we don't return to a class politic, that of Martin Luther King Jr. in a modern sense, or Thomas Paine in a revolutionary sense, this is just what we're going to be in store for. We're all going to be wondering why our own children and grandchildren are so nihilistic and frozen and stuck by trauma. If we don't help address what we've created, instead of our future generations holding us in reverence after we pass, those that even figure out how to survive meaningfully will be dancing on our graves. Lastly, this is just the tip of the iceberg. For a 1-hour show, it's virtually impossible to address what's happening macro or micro in a 1-hour show. So if the show or the audience is interested, there could be numerous segments devoted to economics and market functions, which end up getting codified into law and governing most of our lives. So really important to stay calm and level-headed and talk about these things in a meaningful way. And looking at everything in isolation, in 30-second clips or 2-minute clips, the memification of politics in our society is really, really detrimental, and it's really, really dangerous. We're never really going to actually get around to anything by doing that. So I appreciate the opportunity to give my personal tiny take on these things. I will provide all of the links for this information that I was able to get my hands on. It's all public. These conversations are being had 24 hours a day, and without meaningful populist participation, the result of all of these inflations, whether they be in the housing market or traumatized labor force or in medical costs or poisoning of our water systems or gigantic ag-gag policies that lead to pollution or climate change, all of these things are connected together. So it's really important topics. Really looking forward to the show, and best wishes, and thank you, and thank you for talking about things that are so important. You two are the very, very best. Have a great day.